Imagine walking into your ordinary high school one morning, expecting the usual chaos of teenagers rushing to lockers and complaining about pop quizzes, only to find a girl standing in the hallway wearing full medieval plate armor. Not a costume. Not a prop. Real, battle-scarred metal that catches the fluorescent lights and makes every footstep echo like thunder. Now imagine that beneath that ancient steel lies a secret so profound, so impossible, that it will shatter everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. A secret that explains why Earth has remained hidden from a galaxy teeming with hostile civilizations. A secret that makes one teenage girl the most dangerous weapon in known space. This is the story of Sarah Chen, the girl who appeared at Jefferson High in full armor, and the day humanity discovered it had been protected by guardians they never knew existed. This is the story of why humans are feared across the stars, even by species that have conquered entire solar systems. Welcome to a world where the quiet kid in your chemistry class might be the reason your planet still exists. The morning started like any other at Jefferson High School. Students shuffled through the hallways clutching coffee cups and backpacks, their faces buried in phones or creased with the universal expression of Monday morning dread. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal tune above rows of blue lockers, and the familiar smell of industrial cleaner mixed with teenage body spray hung in the air. Marcus Williams was running late, as usual. His backpack bounced against his shoulder as he hurried toward his first period chemistry class, dodging slower-moving students and trying not to think about the test he hadn't studied for. He rounded the corner near the main office and nearly collided with his best friend Jake, who stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, mouth hanging open. "Dude, move," Marcus said, trying to push past. "Mrs. Patterson's going to kill me if I'm late again." Jake grabbed his arm without taking his eyes off something ahead. "Marcus! Look!" Following his friend's gaze, Marcus felt his own feet root to the spot. Standing near locker 247, as casually as if she were adjusting books for her next class, was a girl in full medieval armor. Not the cheap plastic kind from Halloween stores or the foam replicas from comic conventions. This was real steel, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the hallway lights and dancing patterns across the walls. The armor was beautiful in a way that made Marcus's chest tight. Every piece fitted perfectly, from the articulated gauntlets that moved with fluid grace as she opened her locker, to the intricate engravings that covered the breastplate in flowing, alien script. The metal itself seemed to shimmer with an inner light, as if it were forged from something more than ordinary steel. Other students had begun to notice. Conversations died mid-sentence as more and more people turned to stare. Phones emerged from pockets, cameras already recording. Someone whispered, "Is that Sarah Chen?" and Marcus realized with a shock that it was. Sarah Chen, the quiet girl from his AP physics class. Sarah, who always sat in the back row and never spoke unless called upon. Sarah, who somehow managed to be invisible despite having the highest GPA in their grade. But this wasn't the Sarah he knew. This Sarah moved with a confidence that bordered on predatory grace. Each step in the heavy armor made no sound, despite the fact that she should have been clanking like a walking metal shop. Her dark hair was pulled back in an intricate braid woven with what looked like silver wire, and, when she turned her head, Marcus caught a glimpse of her profile beneath what appeared to be a crown or circlet of the same strange metal as her armor. "Someone call the office," whispered Emma Rodriguez, the student body president. "She can't just wear that to school. It's probably against dress code. And dangerous." But nobody moved to call anyone. They were all transfixed by the sight of Sarah Chen calmly organizing her textbooks while wearing what appeared to be a suit of armor that belonged in a museum. The engravings on her breastplate seemed to move in the light, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric shapes that suggested vast distances and impossible angles. Principal Morrison appeared at the end of the hallway, probably drawn by the unusual quiet. He was a large man who had spent 20 years dealing with teenage drama, dress code violations, and the occasional food fight. Nothing surprised him anymore. At least, that had been true until this morning. He stopped dead when he saw Sarah, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. For a long moment, he simply stared, and Marcus noticed something strange in the man's expression. It wasn't the irritation or confusion he would have expected. It was something closer to recognition. And fear. "Miss Chen," Principal Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled. Could I speak with you in my office, please? Sarah closed her locker with a soft click that somehow echoed more loudly than it should have. When she turned to face the principal, Marcus saw her eyes for the first time that morning. They were still the dark brown he remembered, but there was something different about them. They seemed older, as if they had seen things that 16-year-old eyes should never witness. Of course, Principal Morrison, she said, and her voice carried the same quiet authority that had always made teachers listen when she spoke. Though I believe we both know this conversation has been inevitable for some time. The principal's face went pale. Class will begin shortly, everyone, he announced to the crowd of gawking students. Nothing to see here. But there was everything to see. As Sarah walked past the gathered students toward the office, Marcus noticed details that made his skin crawl with an inexplicable sense of wrongness. Her armor wasn't just decorative. There were scorch marks on one shoulder piece, and what looked suspiciously like claw marks raked across the left gauntlet. The sword at her side wasn't a prop either. The leather of its grip was worn smooth by countless hours of use, and there were dark stains along the crossguard that Marcus really didn't want to think about. Most unsettling of all were the symbols etched into every piece of her armor. They weren't from any Earth culture Marcus could identify, despite his obsession with history and mythology. They seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, forming new patterns that suggested depth and movement in ways that made his brain hurt. "Did you see her sword?" Jake whispered as they watched Sarah disappear into the administrative wing. "That thing looked sharp enough to cut through a car." "Why isn't anyone freaking out more?" Emma asked, looking around at their classmates. "She's literally wearing medieval armor to school. With weapons. This is insane." But Marcus noticed something else that was bothering him. While everyone was staring and whispering, nobody seemed genuinely afraid. Surprised, yes. Confused, absolutely. But not afraid, despite the fact that Sarah was armed and armored like a warrior from another age. If anything, he felt safer with her in the building, which made no logical sense whatsoever. The first bell rang, and students began to disperse reluctantly toward their classes. Marcus found himself walking slowly toward chemistry, his mind spinning with questions. How had Sarah gotten that armor? Where had she learned to move in it like she'd been born wearing steel? And why did Principal Morrison look like he'd been expecting this day to come? In chemistry class, Mrs. Patterson seemed distracted. She kept glancing at Sarah's empty seat and stumbling over words she'd used successfully for 15 years of teaching. When someone asked if Sarah was in trouble, Mrs. Patterson's response was strangely evasive. "Miss Chen is handling some administrative matters," she said. "I'm sure she'll return to class when appropriate." But she wouldn't meet anyone's eyes when she said it, and Marcus noticed her hands shaking slightly as she wrote equations on the whiteboard. During lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with theories about Sarah's dramatic transformation. Some suggested it was an elaborate senior prank, though they were only juniors. Others thought she'd finally snapped under academic pressure. A few joked that she was probably playing some elaborate fantasy role-playing game. Marcus sat with Jake and Emma, picking at his sandwich while they dissected every detail they could remember about Sarah's appearance that morning. Emma had managed to get a few seconds of video before her phone mysteriously glitched and deleted the footage. "I swear the file was there," she insisted. "I recorded at least 30 seconds, and then my phone made this weird noise and everything was gone." "Same thing happened to at least 5 other people," Jake added. "Danny's phone actually shut down completely when he tried to upload to social media. Had to restart it 3 times. Marcus thought about the strange symbols on Sarah's armor, the way they seemed to move and shift. "What if it's not a prank?" he said quietly. His friends stared at him. "What do you mean?" Emma asked. "I mean, what if there's a real reason she's wearing that armor? What if she needs it for something?" Jake laughed, but it sounded forced. "Dude, this is suburban Ohio. What could she possibly need medieval armor for? Fighting off the drama club?" Before Marcus could answer, the lights in the cafeteria flickered. Not the usual electrical hiccup that sometimes happened during storms, but a systematic dimming that started at one end of the room and moved in a wave toward their table. Students looked up from their meals, confusion replacing conversation. Then, the windows began to frost over. It was 75 degrees outside, but ice crystals spread across the glass like living things, forming patterns that looked disturbingly similar to the engravings on Sarah's armor. The temperature in the cafeteria dropped so quickly that Marcus could see his breath. "What the hell?" Emma whispered, and her voice came out in a puff of white vapor. That's when they heard it. A sound from somewhere deep beneath the school, like whale song mixed with grinding metal. It resonated through the floor and into their bones, a frequency that made their teeth ache and their vision blur around the edges. Several students covered their ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside their heads as much as from below. The cafeteria doors burst open, and Sarah Chin strode in, still wearing her impossible armor. But now Marcus could see what the steel had been hiding. Beneath the medieval exterior were technological elements that belonged in no earthly forge. The armor hummed with barely contained energy, and lines of blue light ran along the intricate channels carved into every piece. Her sword was in her hand, and it burned with the same cold fire that now danced behind her eyes. "Everyone stay calm," she announced, her voice carrying clearly over the panicked murmurs. "Remain in your seats and do not look directly at the windows." Too late. Jake had already turned toward the frost-covered glass, and Marcus saw his friend's face go slack with terror. Outside, shapes moved in the ice fog that had surrounded the school. Shapes that were definitely not human, with too many joints and angles that hurt to perceive directly. Sarah's armor flared brighter, and she spoke words in a language that predated human civilization. The grinding sound from below intensified, but now it carried a different tone. Not summons, but challenge. Not invitation, but defiance. "Marcus," Sarah said, and he realized with a shock that she was looking directly at him. "I need you to take Emma and Jake to the library. Mrs. Henderson will know what to do. Tell her the threshold is active and the old agreements are void." "Sarah, what's happening?" Marcus managed to ask, though his throat felt like it was full of ice. She smiled then, and it was nothing like the quiet, shy expression he'd seen in physics class. This smile belonged to someone who had stood against impossible odds and emerged victorious. Someone who had earned the right to wear armor forged in the fires of distant stars. "Humanity's trial period just expired," she said. "Time to see if the species was worth protecting." The windows exploded inward in a shower of ice and glass, and things that had no names in any earthly language began pouring through the gaps. Sarah moved to meet them, her sword describing arcs of fire through the air, and Marcus finally understood why she had come to school in full armor. The war for Earth's survival had begun, and they'd been fighting it in secret for longer than human memory could reach. Marcus grabbed Emma and Jake by their arms, hauling them away from the chaos erupting in the cafeteria. Behind them, Sarah's sword sang through the air with sounds like breaking thunder, and something screamed in frequencies that made their bones ache. The creatures pouring through the shattered windows defied description, their forms shifting between solid matter and something that existed in too many dimensions for human eyes to process properly. "Move!" Marcus shouted, pushing his friends toward the exit. Other students were fleeing in panic, but Marcus noticed something terrifying. Some of them weren't running away from the monsters. Some of them were changing. Jenny Matthews, a cheerleader from their grade, had stopped running when the first creature touched her shadow. Her eyes rolled back, revealing only white, and when she opened her mouth, words poured out in that same impossible language Sarah had spoken. But where Sarah's words had carried authority and power, Jenny's carried hunger and malice. Mrs. Patterson stood at the opposite end of the cafeteria, no longer the slightly frazzled chemistry teacher they knew. Her hands wove complex patterns in the air, and barriers of shimmering light flickered into existence between the students and the advancing horrors. But she was clearly struggling, sweat beading on her forehead as she held back creatures that shouldn't exist. "The library," Marcus gasped, remembering Sarah's instructions. They ran down hallways that seemed longer than they had any right to be, past lockers that reflected impossible images and ceiling tiles that writhed with their own shadows. The normal sounds of the school had been replaced by something that might have been music if music could drive people insane. They reached the library to find Mrs. Henderson calmly reshelving books while reality disintegrated around them. She looked up when they burst through the doors, and Marcus saw that the elderly librarian's eyes held the same ancient awareness he'd glimpsed in Sarah's gaze. Ah, she said, setting down a volume of Shakespeare. I wondered when this day would come. Sarah sent you? She said the threshold is active, Marcus panted. And, the old agreements are void. Mrs. Henderson's face hardened. Sooner than we hoped. She moved to her desk and pressed her palm against what Marcus had always assumed was a decorative metal plate. The entire library shifted around them, walls sliding apart to reveal a room that definitely hadn't existed moments before. The hidden chamber was filled with things that made Marcus's brain hurt to look at directly. Screens showed star maps of constellations he'd never seen, with notations in dozens of different scripts. Weapons lined the walls, some recognizable as advanced versions of earthly designs, others so alien that Marcus couldn't even guess their purpose. And, everywhere, that same script he'd seen on Sarah's armor, pulsing with soft light. Sit, Mrs. Henderson commanded, and, suddenly, she wasn't a kindly librarian anymore. She moved with the same predatory grace Sarah had displayed, and, when she spoke, her voice carried absolute authority. What I'm about to tell you will reshape everything you thought you knew about your species and your world. Jake was staring at a wall display that showed what looked like Earth, but surrounded by a web of energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. That's not possible, he whispered. 30,000 years ago, Mrs. Henderson began, ignoring Jake's denial, humanity was dying. Not from war or disease, but from something far more fundamental. Your species had reached a critical point in its development, the same point that eventually destroys 97% of all sentient life in the galaxy. Emma found her voice. What kind of point? Mrs. Henderson touched another panel, and the displays changed to show images that looked like historical paintings but depicted scenes that had never happened on Earth. Humans in primitive dress standing alongside beings of light and shadow. Battles fought with weapons that turned night to day. Cities that floated in the sky and others that burrowed deep beneath the ocean floor. The point where a species becomes aware of its own potential for transcendence, Mrs. Henderson continued. Most civilizations destroy themselves when they realize they can become more than physical beings. They fragment into factions, each believing they found the one true path to evolution. They tear themselves apart trying to reach godhood. Marcus stared at an image that showed a human figure wreathed in the same blue fire he'd seen around Sarah's sword. But we didn't. No. Because a group of humans made a different choice. Instead of trying to transcend individually, they chose to become guardians for the entire species. They accepted limitations on their own growth in exchange for the power to protect humanity from itself and from the other forces that would exploit your vulnerability during this transition period. The sound of battle was growing closer. Through the library's windows, Marcus could see the sky darkening with shapes that moved wrong, casting shadows that fell upward instead of down. Sarah's voice rang out somewhere in the distance, shouting commands in that ancient language, and each word seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. Sarah is one of these guardians? Emma asked. Sarah is the youngest of the Guardian Council, Mrs. Henderson confirmed. She's only been active for 2 years. Before that, she was just another gifted student, unaware of her heritage. But, when a guardian reaches their 16th year, the awakening begins whether they're ready or not. Jake had found a chair and slumped into it, his face pale. This is insane. You're talking about magic and aliens and secret societies. This is high school, not some fantasy novel. Mrs. Henderson smiled grimly. Magic is just science you don't understand yet. And, as for aliens. She gestured to the screens showing star maps. How do you think your species learned to forge steel? To write? To build cities? You think these advances just appeared spontaneously in isolated human populations across the globe? Marcus felt something click into place in his mind. The Guardians have been guiding human development all along. Not guiding. Protecting. There are forces in this galaxy that feed on the psychic energy released when a species destroys itself during transcendence. They've been waiting 30,000 years for humanity to reach this point. Today, something has changed. The barriers we've maintained around Earth have begun to weaken. The building shook as something massive impacted the roof. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the lights flickered. But the hidden chamber's illumination never wavered, powered by sources that drew energy from the same place Sarah's armor found its fire.
"What's attacking us?" Marcus asked.
"The Devourers," Mrs. Henderson said simply. "They're not truly alive in any sense you would understand. They're quantum parasites that exist in the spaces between realities. When a species reaches transcendence potential, the Devourers slip through the cracks in spacetime to feed. Earth has been hidden from them by the Guardian Network, but something has disrupted our concealment."
Emma was studying a screen that showed what looked like a battle taking place in orbit around Earth.
Ships that looked like crystalline insects were engaging sleek vessels that hummed with the same energy as Sarah's armor.
"Are we winning?" Mrs. Henderson's expression was grim. "The space battle is a distraction. The real threat is here, now.
The Devourers have found a way to manifest physically on Earth. If they establish a foothold in our reality, they can begin the harvesting process."
"Harvesting?" Jake asked, though his voice suggested he really didn't want to know. "Human consciousness. The Devourers don't just kill.
They consume the essence of what makes a species unique.
If they succeed here, humanity won't just die. You'll never have existed at all.
Every achievement, every work of art, every moment of love or discovery will be erased from the cosmic record." Marcus thought about Jenny Matthews in the cafeteria, her eyes white and alien words pouring from her mouth. "Some of the students are already infected."
"Possessed," Mrs. Henderson corrected. "The Devourers can't manifest directly in our reality without destroying the fabric of spacetime itself. So they use human hosts as anchors. But the process burns out the host's nervous system within hours. Those students won't survive, even if we win."
The sound of fighting was moving closer. Through the doorway leading back to the normal library, Marcus could see flashes of blue light and hear Sarah's voice raised in what sounded like ancient war songs. Something roared in response, a sound like tearing metal that made their teeth ache.
"Why are you telling us this?" Emma asked. "Why not just memory wipe us and send us home?"
Mrs. Henderson was gathering items from around the chamber, weapons and devices that looked like crystallized starlight. "Because the old agreements are void," as Sarah said. "The Guardian system is failing. We need help, and, for the first time in 30,000 years, we need it from unawakened humans." She pressed something into Marcus's hand. It looked like a smooth stone, but it was warm and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat.
"This is a resonance anchor.
As long as you carry it, the Devourers can't possess you.
But, more importantly, it will allow you to see through their illusions."
Jake and Emma received similar stones, though theirs flickered with different colored light. The moment Marcus closed his fingers around his anchor, the world around him shifted. The hidden chamber became visible as it truly was, not just advanced technology but a fusion of science and something far older. The walls were covered with symbols that told the story of humanity's hidden history, and the weapons weren't just tools but works of art that sang with barely contained power.
"What do you need us to do?"
Marcus asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Help us evacuate the uninfected students.
The Devourers will try to possess as many humans as possible to anchor themselves more firmly in our reality. Every person we save weakens their foothold."
Mrs. Henderson handed each of them what looked like a police radio, but the device in Marcus's hands was warm and seemed to respond to his thoughts rather than his fingers. "These will let you communicate with the active Guardians. Sarah and the others are spread throughout the building, trying to contain the outbreak." Another massive impact shook the building, and this time Marcus heard the unmistakable sound of structural damage. Ceiling tiles crashed down in the main library, and through the walls came the sound of students screaming.
"How many Guardians are there?" Emma asked as they prepared to leave the safety of the hidden chamber. "In this region?"
"For active Guardians, including Sarah.
Worldwide, fewer than 200. We're not an army, children. We're the last line of defense for a species that doesn't even know it's at war."
They moved back into the main library, and Marcus immediately saw the truth that his resonance anchor revealed. What had looked like a normal school library now showed its true nature. Books lined the shelves, yes, but between them were gaps that opened onto other spaces, other dimensions. Some led to laboratories where Guardian technology was developed. Others opened onto battlefields where wars had been fought for the future of human consciousness.
Mrs. Henderson was no longer disguised as an elderly librarian.
She moved in armor similar to Sarah's, though hers was silver rather than steel, and the symbols carved into its surface told different stories.
Stories of knowledge preserved and wisdom passed down through generations of hidden protectors.
Remember, she said as they approached the main doors, the Devourers feed on fear and despair. Stay focused on protecting others, not on the impossibility of what you're seeing. And, whatever happens, don't look directly into their primary forms. Human minds weren't designed to process that level of existential wrongness. They stepped out into a school that no longer belonged to the same reality they'd woken up in that morning. The hallways stretched in directions that violated Euclidean geometry, and the lockers reflected images from a dozen different times and places. Students huddled in classrooms that flickered between their normal appearance and something that looked like the inside of a living organism. And, through it all, Sarah's voice could be heard, raised in songs that held back the dark, while her sword carved paths of light through an invasion that threatened not just Earth, but the very concept of human existence. The hallways of Jefferson High had become a maze of impossibilities. Marcus led Emma and Jake through corridors that bent in directions his mind refused to accept, following the pulse of his resonance anchor toward clusters of uninfected students. The radio device Mrs. Henderson had given him crackled with urgent communications between the Guardians scattered throughout the building. "Sector 7 is clear," came a voice he didn't recognize, speaking with an accent that suggested centuries of practice with multiple languages. "Moving to reinforce the gymnasium." "Negative," Sarah's voice cut through the static.
"The gymnasium is lost. Whatever you do, don't enter the main court. They've opened a primary manifestation there." Marcus pressed the talk button, hoping he was doing it right. "Mrs. Henderson, we're heading toward the East Wing. How many students are still unaccounted for?" 43, came the reply.
"But, Marcus, be aware that the Devourers are learning to mimic human behavior.
Don't trust anyone who won't touch your resonance anchor."
They rounded a corner and nearly collided with a group of terrified sophomores huddled outside the art room. Marcus recognized most of them, but when he approached, his anchor grew cold against his palm. The students looked normal, but something was wrong with their shadows. Instead of falling naturally, the shadows reached toward Marcus and his friends like grasping fingers.
"Hey," called out Danny Morrison, the principal's son. "Over here. We found a safe room."
But Emma grabbed Marcus's arm before he could move toward the group. Her own anchor was flickering rapidly, and her face had gone pale.
"That's not Danny," she whispered. "Look at his eyes."
Marcus looked more closely and saw what had frightened her. Danny's eyes reflected light like an animal's, but the reflections showed images that couldn't be there. Glimpses of vast spaces between stars, of hunger that spanned geological ages, of intelligence so alien that human minds could only perceive it as malevolent emptiness. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, backing away slowly.
The thing wearing Danny's face tilted its head at an angle that would have broken vertebrae.
"But we've been waiting so long to meet you," it said, and its voice carried harmonics that made their teeth ache. 30,000 years of hiding behind your guardians.
Don't you want to finally be free?" More students emerged from the art room, all moving with the same unnatural fluidity.
Marcus counted 8 of them, but his anchor was screaming warnings that suggested far more presences than visible bodies. The Devourers weren't just possessing individuals. They were using the possessed as focal points to manifest portions of their true forms in reality.
"Run," Marcus said quietly, and then, louder when his friends hesitated, "Run." They sprinted back down the hallway as inhuman howls erupted behind them.
The possessed students moved faster than any human should be able to, their feet barely touching the ground as they gave chase. But Marcus noticed something important. They weren't trying to catch up. They were herding him and his friends toward something. The radio crackled.
"Marcus, can you hear me?"
It was Sarah, and she sounded exhausted.
"We're in the East Wing," Marcus gasped as they ran.
"There's a group of possessed students chasing us."
"How many?"
8 visible, but the anchor says there are more." A pause, then Sarah's voice came back grim with determination.
They're driving you toward the auditorium. Whatever you do, don't go near the stage. Head for the music rooms instead. Mr. Kowalski should be there with another group of survivors.
They changed direction, taking a stairwell that led toward the music department. Behind them, the howling grew louder and more complex, as if multiple throats were trying to sing in harmony but using scales that human ears weren't designed to process. The music hallway was eerily quiet when they reached it, but Marcus's anchor gave off a warm, steady pulse that suggested safety nearby. They found Mr. Kowalski, the band director, barricaded in the instrument storage room with 15 other students. But, when Marcus saw him, he understood why Mrs. Henderson had sent them here. Mr. Kowalski wore no armor, but symbols similar to those on Sarah's equipment glowed softly on his arms, visible through his rolled-up sleeves. He moved with the same controlled grace Marcus was beginning to associate with the Guardians, and, when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made even the most panicked students calm down and listen. "You made it," he said when he saw Marcus and his friends.
"Henderson told me you were coming. How bad is it out there?"
"Bad," Emma said, slumping against a wall lined with guitar cases.
"The whole school is falling apart. Literally. Gravity doesn't work right in half the hallways." Mr. Kowalski nodded grimly. "The Devourers are pulling our local spacetime toward their reality. If they establish a strong enough foothold, the effect will spread. First the school, then the town, then the continent." One of the other students, a junior named Amy, looked up from where she'd been crying. "Mr. K, what's happening? People are saying there are monsters in the building, but that's crazy, right?"
Marcus expected Mr. Kowalski to come up with some comforting lie, but, instead, the band director sat down beside Amy and spoke with gentle honesty.
"There are creatures here that don't belong in our reality.
But, there are also people fighting them. People who have been protecting our world for longer than recorded history. What you're seeing today is real, but so is the fact that we have defenders."
"Like Sarah Chan?" asked another student.
"Sarah is one of the youngest and most powerful guardians we've ever had," Mr. Kowalski confirmed.
"Her armor isn't medieval.
It's made from materials that exist in folded space, forged in the heart of a dying star by the first human guardians 30 millennia ago. Every piece was created to channel forces that could unmake reality itself." Marcus's radio buzzed with an incoming message. "All units, be advised.
Primary manifestation is beginning in the gymnasium. Estimate 15 minutes before full materialization." Mr. Kowalski's face went pale. "We need to evacuate. Now. What happens if they complete the manifestation?"
Jake asked as they began gathering the other students. "Then, instead of using possessed humans as anchors, they'll have a stable gateway between realities," Mr. Kowalski explained while checking a device that looked like a compass but pointed toward dimensions instead of magnetic north. "Once that happens, they can begin pulling Earth into their feeding dimension."
They moved as a group toward an exit that Mr. Kowalski's device indicated was still safe.
But, as they approached the door leading to the parking lot, Marcus's anchor suddenly flared with warning heat. Through the windows, he could see that the outside world was no longer the suburban Ohio they'd grown up in. The sky had taken on the color of old blood, and shapes moved through clouds that flickered between normal cumulus formations and geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. In the distance, where the shopping mall should have been, something that might have been a mountain or might have been a sleeping creature rose against the horizon. "The effect is spreading faster than we anticipated," Mr. Kowalski said quietly. The radio crackled again, this time with a voice Marcus didn't recognize.
"Guardian Network, this is Shepard. I'm reading massive reality distortions centered on your location.
What's your status?"
Mr. Kowalski grabbed the radio. "This is Guardian 6.
We have civilian evacuation in progress, but the primary manifestation is accelerating.
Request immediate support." Negative on immediate support. The Devourers have manifested simultaneously on 7 continents. All active Guardians are engaged.
You're on your own until the current wave is repelled. Marcus felt his heart sink. Sarah and Mrs. Henderson were fighting alone against creatures that could rewrite the laws of physics. And they had 15 minutes before those creatures became permanently anchored in reality.
There has to be something we can do, Emma said, echoing his thoughts.
Mr. Kowalski looked at the group of frightened teenagers surrounding them, then, at the impossible landscape visible through the windows.
There might be, he said slowly. But, it's dangerous, and I can't guarantee it will work. More dangerous than sitting here while reality collapses? Marcus asked.
Mr. Kowalski smiled grimly.
Fair point.
He led them back into the music room and opened a storage cabinet Marcus had passed 100 times without really noticing. Inside, instead of sheet music and instrument accessories, were items that definitely didn't belong in a high school.
Crystals that hummed with their own internal music.
Books written in scripts that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. And instruments that looked familiar until you realized they had too many strings, or valves that opened onto empty space, or percussion surfaces that showed reflections of other worlds. Music is mathematics, Mr. Kowalski explained as he began distributing the impossible instruments. And mathematics is the language of reality itself. The first Guardians discovered that certain musical frequencies can strengthen the barriers between dimensions, or open controlled pathways for those who know the proper songs. He handed Marcus something that looked like a violin but felt warm and alive in his hands. The Devourers are mathematical parasites. They survive by introducing chaos into ordered systems. But if we can create enough harmonic resonance, we can actually push them back toward their own reality. Emma received a flute that seemed to be carved from crystallized starlight. Jake got drums that had been shaped from what looked like meteorite metal. The other students were given instruments that defied easy description, devices that combined familiar musical concepts with technology that belonged in no earthly orchestra.
We're going to fight interdimensional parasites with a school band?
Amy asked, but she was already examining the harp-like instrument Mr. Kowalski had given her.
We're going to sing them home, Mr. Kowalski corrected. Every reality has its own fundamental frequency, its own harmonic signature.
If we can match the Devourer's home dimension and create a resonant feedback loop, we can force them back where they belong. The building shook again, and through the walls came a sound that was definitely not human. It rose and fell in patterns that suggested vast intelligence and impossible hunger, a voice that spoke of the spaces between galaxies and the cold mathematics of entropy.
That's their calling song, Mr. Kowalski said, his face grim. They're summoning reinforcements from their reality. We have maybe 10 minutes before this becomes unwinnable.
He positioned them around the room, each student holding an instrument that seemed to respond to their thoughts as much as their fingers. Marcus's violin felt warm in his hands, and, when he drew the bow across its strings experimentally, the sound that emerged was nothing like any violin he'd ever heard. It was pure music, notes that existed in frequencies his ears shouldn't have been able to perceive. Listen for the harmony beneath their chaos, Mr. Kowalski instructed, raising a baton that sparkled with the same energy as the Guardian weapons. Feel for the mathematical structure that holds their reality together. When I give the signal, we're going to play them a song that reminds them why they belong in the dark between stars, not in a world where teenagers worry about chemistry tests and college applications. The Devourer's song grew louder, and the walls of the music room began to resonate in sympathy.
But, as Marcus listened, he began to hear something else underneath the alien harmonies.
A pattern, a structure, a rhythm that spoke of home and belonging and the pull of one's own reality. Sarah's voice came over the radio one more time, faint and strained.
The manifestation is nearly complete. Whatever you're planning, do it now.
Mr. Kowalski raised his baton, and 15 teenagers lifted impossible instruments in preparation to wage war against creatures that fed on the death of civilizations. Marcus thought about everything he'd learned that day, about guardians and hidden history and the thin barriers that protected ordinary human life from cosmic horror. Then, he placed his bow against the strings of an instrument forged in the heart of a dying star, and began to play a song that would either save reality or shatter it completely. The first notes that emerged from their impossible orchestra were chaos. 15 teenagers with no training in interdimensional harmonics attempting to play instruments that responded to thought and emotion as much as technique. Marcus's violin screamed discordantly, Emma's crystal flute produced sounds like breaking glass, and Jake's meteorite drums thundered with rhythms that seemed to come from the birth of galaxies. But Mr. Kowalski didn't stop them or ask them to start over. Instead, he conducted with the same patient intensity he'd shown during countless school band practices, listening for the structure beneath the chaos, waiting for the moment when amateur musicians would stop fighting their instruments and start working with them. The building around them was disintegrating. Through the windows, Marcus could see the parking lot folding in on itself, cars becoming geometric abstractions that hurt to perceive directly. The sky had taken on the texture of old parchment, and things that might have been stars or might have been eyes watched them from configurations that violated the normal rules of astronomy. "Don't focus on the notes," Mr. Kowalski called out over the cacophony. "Focus on what you want the music to accomplish. Think about home. Think about the reality where you belong, where your friends and family exist, where physics works the way it should." Amy's heart began to settle into something that sounded almost like music, its crystalline strings resonating with frequencies that made Marcus's bones vibrate in harmony. Other students were finding their rhythm too, each instrument beginning to contribute to a pattern that was more than the sum of its parts. The radio crackled with Sarah's voice, strained with exhaustion and barely audible over the sound of combat. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. The manifestation is slowing down." Marcus felt something click into place as his violin found its voice. The instrument wasn't fighting him anymore. Instead, it was responding to his intentions, translating his desperate desire to protect his world into mathematical constructs that existed in dimensions beyond normal spacetime. The melody that emerged was haunting and beautiful, but underneath its beauty lay equations that could rewrite the fundamental constants of reality. Emma's flute joined in, its crystalline voice adding harmonies that spoke of light and hope and the stubborn human refusal to surrender to impossible odds. Jake's drums provided a heartbeat that echoed the pulse of a living world, rhythms that celebrated gravity and time and all the reliable forces that made ordinary life possible. But it was when the other students began to truly play that Marcus understood what they were accomplishing. Each instrument added its voice to a growing symphony that was more than music. It was a declaration of existence, a mathematical proof that their reality had the right to continue existing, a harmonic argument against entropy and chaos and the dark hunger that fed on dying civilizations. The Devourer's calling song faltered. Through the walls came sounds of confusion and something that might have been pain, if creatures of pure mathematics could experience pain. The possessed students in human howling began to fragment, losing the unified harmony that had made it so terrifying. "Now," Mr. Kowalski said, and his baton began to glow with the same blue fire Marcus had seen around Sarah's sword. "Play them home." The music shifted, becoming something that pulled at the fabric of spacetime itself. Marcus felt his violin reaching across dimensional barriers, touching the reality where the Devourers belonged. It was a place of beautiful emptiness, of mathematical purity unmarred by the messy complexity of living worlds. A place where consciousness existed as pure equation, where hunger was a philosophical concept rather than a biological drive. The calling song that had been drawing more Devourers to Earth began to reverse itself, becoming instead a pathway back to their own reality. Through the music, Marcus could feel the creatures' confusion and growing fear as they realized what was happening. They had expected to find easy prey, a species destroying itself during transcendence. Instead, they had encountered something unprecedented, humans who could create harmony from chaos, who could turn their own limitations into strength. "Mrs. Henderson," Mr. Kowalski spoke into his radio, "are you reading the dimensional resonance patterns?" "Confirmed," came the response, excitement clear in the librarian's voice. "Primary manifestation is collapsing. Possessed subjects are showing signs of release from devourer influence." But even as their music began to push the invasion back, Marcus could feel the cost. The instruments they were playing weren't just tools. They were conduits for forces that human minds weren't designed to channel directly. His hands were shaking, and he could taste copper in his mouth. Around the room, other students were showing similar signs of strain. Amy was crying tears that sparkled with starlight, and Jake's drumsticks left trails of light in the air. "How long do we need to maintain this?" Emma gasped between phrases. "Until the last devourer returns to its own reality," Mr. Kowalski replied, but his own voice was strained. "And until we can seal the dimensional weak points they used to enter our world." The music was changing them. Marcus could feel it happening, the same transformation that had turned ordinary humans into guardians 30,000 years ago. The resonance anchors that protected them from possession were also opening their minds to frequencies of existence beyond normal human perception. He was beginning to see the mathematical structures that underlied physical reality, the elegant equations that governed everything from atomic bonds to the formation of galaxies. Through the windows, the impossible landscape was shifting back toward normal. The blood-red sky was fading to blue, and the geometric distortions in the parking lot were resolving into familiar cars and trees. But Marcus knew that he would never see these ordinary things the same way again. He could perceive the quantum fluctuations that made seemingly solid matter dance with constant motion, the gravitational fields that bent spacetime around every object, the electromagnetic spectra that painted the world in colors his eyes had never been able to detect. Sarah's voice came over the radio, clearer now and filled with something that might have been hope.
Dimensional barriers are stabilizing. The gymnasium manifestation is in full collapse. Whatever you did, it's working.
But Mr. Kowalski's expression remained grim. The immediate threat is passing, he said, never taking his eyes off his conducting. But this was just the first wave. The devourers will return, and next time they'll be prepared for musical resistance. As if summoned by his words, a new sound emerged from the depths of the building. Not the chaotic howling of frustrated parasites, but something far more organized. The remaining devourers were learning from what they'd experienced, adapting their own harmonics to counter the students' musical defenses. "They're changing their song," Amy called out, her harp strings beginning to vibrate in sympathy with the new alien melody. Marcus felt his violin struggling to maintain its protective frequencies as the devourers' adapted calling song began to overwhelm their defenses. The creatures weren't just fleeing anymore. They were fighting back, using mathematical weapons that turned sound itself into a battlefield. "Everyone stay focused," Mr. Kowalski commanded, but Marcus could see sweat beading on the band director's forehead.
"Remember, we're not trying to defeat them. We're trying to convince them that our reality isn't worth consuming."
But the devourers had learned something crucial during their brief manifestation on Earth. They had tasted human consciousness, experienced the unique flavor of a species that could create beauty from limitation, order from chaos.
And they wanted more. The new calling song wasn't just summoning reinforcements.
It was an analysis of human nature itself, a mathematical dissection of what made humanity unique among the galaxy's sentient species.
The devourers were no longer content to simply feed on humanity's transcendence energy.
They wanted to understand it, to incorporate it into their own existence. "They're not leaving," Emma realized, her voice tight with growing panic.
"They're trying to become us."
And that was when the true horror of their situation became clear.
The devourers weren't just interdimensional parasites.
They were evolution itself, the force that drove species toward transcendence and, then, fed on the energy released when that transcendence destroyed them.
Humanity wasn't just another meal.
Humanity was a test case, a species that had somehow managed to find a third option between self-destruction and cosmic irrelevance. The creatures wanted to learn how humans had achieved the impossible, transcendence without destruction, evolution without extinction. And they were willing to tear apart reality itself to discover the secret. "Play louder," Mr. Kowalski commanded, and his baton now blazed with the same fire that powered Sarah's weapons.
"Play like everything you've ever loved depends on it."
Because it does. The music swelled to impossible volumes, each instrument contributing to a symphony that existed in frequencies beyond normal spacetime. But now it wasn't just defensive. It was a declaration of war, a musical manifesto that proclaimed humanity's right to exist on its own terms, to evolve in its own way, to find its own path among the stars. And, somewhere in the depths of Jefferson High School, Sarah Chen raised her voice to join their song, her words adding lyrics to their melody, lyrics in a language that predated human speech but somehow expressed everything that made humanity worth protecting. Together, 16 ordinary people created music that would either save their species or herald its transformation into something that no longer belonged in the reality where they had been born. Sarah's voice joined their music like a sword cutting through silk, her ancient words weaving through their melodies and transforming their defensive symphony into something far more powerful. Marcus felt the change immediately as his violin responded to her lyrics, the instrument's crystalline strings resonating with frequencies that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the quantum fluctuations that made reality possible. The Devourer's adaptive song faltered as Sarah's words rewrote the mathematical foundations of their attack. But this wasn't just another Guardian technique. Sarah was doing something unprecedented, something that made the symbols on her armor blaze with light so intense that Marcus had to shield his eyes even through the music room walls.
What is she doing?
Emma gasped, her crystal flute now producing notes that sounded like singing stars. Mr. Kowalski's face was tight with concentration as he conducted their impossible orchestra, but Marcus caught a glimpse of something that might have been pride in his expression.
She's offering them a choice, he said.
Instead of fighting the devourers or trying to send them away, she's showing them what they could become if they stopped feeding on destruction. Through their music, Marcus began to understand what Sarah was attempting.
The devourers weren't inherently evil, any more than fire was evil for burning or gravity was evil for pulling things down. They were part of the cosmic ecosystem, serving the function of cleaning up the psychic debris left behind when species destroyed themselves during transcendence attempts.
They had evolved to feed on chaos and failure because that was what most civilizations produced when they reached this crucial point in their development. But humanity had found a different path. Instead of transcending individually and tearing their civilization apart in the process, humans had chosen guardians who would limit their own evolution in order to protect the species as a whole. It was a solution so unusual that the devourers had no framework for processing it. They had come to Earth expecting to find familiar patterns of self-destruction, only to encounter something that challenged their fundamental understanding of how consciousness evolved.
Sarah's song wasn't trying to banish the devourers.
It was offering them a chance to evolve too, to become something more than cosmic scavengers. She was showing them how they could feed on creation instead of destruction, how they could help species transcend successfully instead of feasting on their failures. The alien calling song that had been attacking their defenses began to change, its mathematical hostility transforming into something that sounded almost like curiosity. Through the walls, Marcus could hear the possessed students speaking again, but their voices were no longer filled with inhuman hunger. They sounded confused, lost, like people waking from dreams they couldn't quite remember. "The possession is breaking," Amy called out, her harp now producing harmonies that seemed to accelerate the healing process.
"I can feel them letting go."
But the transformation wasn't without cost. As the devourers released their human hosts and began to consider Sarah's unprecedented offer, the barriers between realities became even more unstable. The music room itself was beginning to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and Marcus could see versions of himself playing violin in infinite variations, each one slightly different from the last. "Hold the frequency," Mr. Kowalski commanded, his conducting becoming more urgent.
"The dimensional boundaries are fluctuating.
If we lose coherence now, we could scatter ourselves across parallel realities." Marcus gritted his teeth and focused on his violin, using the resonance anchor as a point of stability while reality shifted around them. The instrument was no longer just responding to his fingers, it was reading his thoughts, his emotions, his desperate desire to protect the world where his friends and family existed. The music that emerged was uniquely his, a melody that spoke of teenage dreams and late-night conversations and the fierce loyalty that bound him to people who had just discovered that their quiet classmate was humanity's secret protector. Emma's flute wove harmonies around his melody, adding her own voice to the musical argument for humanity's continued existence. Her music spoke of art and beauty and the human capacity to find wonder in even the most ordinary moments. Jake's drums provided the heartbeat that kept them all connected, rhythms that celebrated the messy, chaotic, impossibly precious reality of human life. The other students added their own voices, each instrument contributing something essential to the growing symphony. Together, they created music that was more than the sum of its parts, a harmonic proof that collaboration could create beauty beyond individual capability. It was everything that made humanity worth preserving, everything that justified the Guardian's 30,000-year vigil, translated into mathematical frequencies that even interdimensional parasites could understand. Sarah's voice rose above their instruments, no longer singing in the ancient Guardian language but in words that Marcus recognized as his own. She was singing about Jefferson High School, about chemistry tests and cafeteria food and the peculiar terror of asking someone to prom. She was singing about all the small, precious, utterly mundane experiences that made human life valuable despite its brevity and limitations. And, incredibly, impossibly, the devourers began to respond. Their adaptive song shifted again, but this time toward harmony rather than dominance. They were learning to create instead of consume, to build up rather than tear down. The possessed students throughout the building were being released as the creatures that had controlled them evolved beyond the need for hosts. "It's working," Mrs. Henderson's voice crackled through the radio, filled with wonder. "The devourers are withdrawing, but not to their home dimension. They're moving into the spaces between realities, where they can observe and learn without interfering." The building around them began to stabilize as the immediate threat passed. Walls that had been folded through impossible dimensions snapped back to their normal configurations. Gravity reasserted itself in directions that made sense to human perception. The sky outside the windows returned to its proper blue, though Marcus noticed that he could still see the mathematical structures underlying its apparent simplicity. But the music didn't stop. If anything, it grew stronger as 15 teenagers and one Guardian band director continued playing the song that had just rewritten the rules of cosmic evolution. They were no longer fighting for survival. They were celebrating the birth of something new, a form of cooperation between species that had never existed before in the galaxy's long history. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the music room, her armor still glowing with residual energy but her expression peaceful for the first time that day. She was no longer the terrifying warrior Marcus had seen in the cafeteria. She was just Sarah Chin again, the quiet girl from AP Physics who happened to carry the weight of humanity's survival on her shoulders. "You did it," she said simply, and her smile was worth every impossible thing they had experienced that day. But Mr. Kowalski wasn't ready to stop conducting. "One more movement," he said, his baton still blazing with Guardian fire. "We need to seal this properly, make sure the dimensional weak points are stable." The final movement of their symphony was different from everything that had come before. Instead of the desperate urgency of battle or the joyous celebration of victory, it was a song of building and binding, of making permanent the new relationship between humanity and the forces that had once threatened their existence. Marcus felt his violin weaving protective patterns around the school, around the town, around the entire planet, creating barriers that would hold not through force but through mutual agreement. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was profound. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of peace, of a world that had been forever changed but was still recognizably home. "So what happens now?" Emma asked, setting down her crystal flute with reverent care. Sarah looked around at the 15 teenagers who had just helped save their species, her expression thoughtful. "Now you go back to your regular classes. You take your chemistry tests and worry about college applications and argue about which movie to see on Friday night. But you'll never be quite the same, because you've seen what you're capable of when everything you love is at stake." "And the devourers?" Jake asked. "They're learning to be gardeners instead of scavengers," Sarah replied. "They're still out there, still part of the cosmic ecosystem. But now they're helping species transcend successfully instead of feeding on their failures. Humanity just taught the galaxy a new way to evolve." Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, back to looking like an ordinary librarian despite the residual starlight in her eyes. "The immediate crisis is over," she announced. But this was never going to be the end of the story. "You've all been changed by what happened here today. You've been exposed to Guardian frequencies, touched by forces that exist beyond normal spacetime." Marcus looked at his hands, which still tingled with memory of the violin that had responded to his thoughts. "Are you saying we're going to become Guardians too?" "That's your choice to make," Sarah said gently. "The transformation has begun, but it's not irreversible yet. You can return to normal human lives if you want. Or you can join us in protecting a species that's just taken its first real step toward galactic citizenship." Marcus thought about the choice before him. He could go back to being a normal teenager, forget about interdimensional parasites and mathematical music and the weight of cosmic responsibility. Or he could embrace a destiny he had never imagined, becoming part of a tradition that stretched back to the dawn of human consciousness. He looked around at his friends, seeing the same decision reflected in their faces. Emma, who had always dreamed of making a difference in the world. Jake, who had never found anything that truly challenged him until today. Amy and the other students, all of them transformed by an experience that had shown them what they were truly capable of. Outside, the school day was continuing as if nothing had happened. Students were going to their next classes, teachers were writing equations on whiteboards, and the normal rhythm of adolescent life was reasserting itself. But underneath that surface normalcy, something fundamental had changed.
Earth was no longer hidden from the galaxy's attention.
Humanity had announced its presence by doing something unprecedented, by finding a way to transform natural enemies into allies through the power of collaborative creation. The 30,000-year age of secret guardianship was ending, and humanity was about to take its first steps onto a cosmic stage that was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had ever imagined. Sarah Chen put away her sword and began removing her armor, revealing once again the quiet girl who sat in the back of their physics class. But Marcus would never forget what he had seen beneath the steel, the courage and wisdom and unshakable determination that made her worthy of carrying weapons forged in dying stars. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, shouldering her backpack like any other student heading to their next class. Marcus smiled, feeling the resonance anchor pulse warmly against his palm, feeling the echo of cosmic music still vibrating in his bones. Tomorrow he would make his choice about the future, about whether to remain human or become something more. But today had taught him something that no amount of guardian training could improve upon. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was stand with your friends and create something beautiful from chaos. Sometimes the most heroic act was simply refusing to let the darkness win. And sometimes a quiet girl appearing at school in full armor was exactly what the universe needed to remember why some things were worth protecting, no matter the cost.